One second I was standing in the kitchen holding a plate of food I'd cooked myself, and the next I was outside on the front porch with the door locked behind me, because I'd asked my stepmother a question she didn't like. That was the night everything changed. It was the evening before her wedding. My father had been gone for 6 years, declared legally dead after his car went into the Morrow River, and they never recovered a body. I was 26, living in the house I grew up in, the house my mother had bought with her own money before she ever met my father, the house she left to me in her will. Or so I'd believed my entire life. My stepmother's name was Diane. She had moved in 3 years after my mother died, when I was 14, and she had a way of making every room feel slightly smaller than it was. She didn't yell. She didn't throw things. She just had this particular tone, calm, precise, final, that made it clear she had already decided how things were going to go, and your only job was to catch up. The question I asked her that evening was simple. I'd found a copy of my mother's will in a box while cleaning out the garage. I'd read it twice. Then I'd walked into the kitchen, where Diane was having a glass of wine with her sister, and I'd said, quietly, that I'd like to talk about the house. She looked at me the way you look at a moth that's flown into your kitchen. A little surprised it got in, already thinking about how to get it out. She said, not tonight. I said, I think it needs to be tonight. That was the question she didn't like. Her sister excused herself. Diane set her wine glass down on the counter with a small precise click, and she looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, you need some air? Go outside. I almost laughed. I said, I'm 28 years old. She said, then act like it and give me space on the night before my wedding. I don't know why I walked to the door. I think part of me believes she would stop me, would realize how absurd it was, would call me back and sit down and talk like adults. But I walked to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch, and 3 seconds later I heard the deadbolt turn. I stood there in the November cold with no jacket, no phone, no keys. The porch light buzzed above me. Through the front window I could see Diane walking back to the kitchen, picking up her wine glass, resuming her conversation with her sister like I'd never existed at all. I sat on the porch steps. The neighborhood was quiet. The house across the street had its lights on, and I could see the blue flicker of a television through the curtains. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The cold worked its way through my shirt, and I pressed my arms against my sides, and I thought about my mother. Her name was Carol. She was a nurse for 22 years. She bought this house before I was born, paid it off in 11 years, and kept the deed in a fireproof box in the hall closet. I had found the will in the garage, but the deed, I hadn't seen the deed in years. I'd assumed it was still in the closet. I'd assumed a lot of things. I had been sitting outside for maybe 40 minutes when the black car pulled up. It came slowly, the way cars move when they're looking for an address. A dark sedan, clean, with out-of-state plates I couldn't read from the steps. It parked directly in front of the house, and for a moment nothing happened. The engine went quiet. The porch light reflected off the windshield and I couldn't see inside. Then the driver's door opened and a man got out. He was tall. He was wearing a dark coat, and he moved with a deliberateness that made me feel like I was watching something that had been planned for a very long time. He came around the front of the car and he stopped at the edge of the driveway, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and it took me 4 full seconds to understand what I was seeing. My father was not dead. His name is Robert. He looked older. Of course he did. It had been 6 years, but it was him. Same height, same way of standing with his weight slightly forward like he was about to start walking again. There was a scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before. His hair had gone mostly gray. I stood up from the steps and I think I said his name. I'm not completely sure. Everything from those first 30 seconds is slightly blurred, the way memories get when the emotion is too large for the moment to hold. He said, I know, just listen to me. I need you to listen. I said, you've been alive for 6 years. He said, yes. I said, 6 years. He said, I know what I did. I need you to let me explain, and then you can decide what you want to do with me. But right now you're sitting outside your own house without a coat, and we need to deal with that first. He had a coat in the back seat. He handed it to me through the car window, and I put it on without thinking, because I was cold and my brain wasn't fully operating, and he was standing in front of me alive after 6 years, and I had no framework for any of it. We sat in the car, the heat was running. He told me everything. He had left, he said, because Diane had made it impossible for him to stay. Not in the way I might think, Not an affair, not a falling out. Something worse. Diane had come to him 4 months before his car went into the river, and she had shown him documents. Financial documents. Evidence, she said, that he had been diverting money from his company's pension fund for years. She told him she had copies in 3 locations. She told him that if he didn't sign over power of attorney for my mother's estate, my mother had been dead for 2 years by then, and leave quietly, she would hand the documents to the federal prosecutor she'd been in contact with for 6 weeks. He said the documents were fabricated. He said he'd had a lawyer look at them, and the lawyer told him they were good enough to hold up long enough to destroy him, even if they ultimately fell apart. He had a business with 40 employees. He had me, a 16-year-old who'd already lost his mother. He made a calculation that he has regretted every day since, and he drove his car to the Morrow River Bridge and walked away from it and let the world think he was dead. I sat there and listened to all of it, and when he finished, I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, "She took the house." He said, "I know." I said, "My mother left the house to me. I found the will tonight." He said, "The will you found is real. The deed transfer that happened 8 months after I disappeared is not." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and he took out a manila envelope and he held it out to me. I opened it. Inside was a copy of my mother's original deed, a copy of the transfer document that had moved the property into Diane's name, and a 12-page report from a forensic documents examiner dated 6 weeks ago. My mother's signature on the transfer document was a forgery. I looked up at him. He said, "I've been working on this for 2 years. I had to be careful. If she found out I was alive before I had everything in place, she would have moved the documents and I would have had nothing." I said, "Why tonight? Why are you here tonight?" He said, "Because she's getting married tomorrow morning. If she gets married, the house becomes marital property and the legal situation gets significantly more complicated." He paused. "And because I've been parked on this street for 3 nights, and tonight was the first time I saw you go outside." I thought about that, about him sitting in this car 3 nights in a row watching the house where I'd been living with a woman who had forged my mother's signature and taken the roof from over my head, and I hadn't known any of it. I said, "What do we do?" He said, "Tonight, nothing. You're not going back in that house. I have a hotel room and a lawyer who is meeting us there in 45 minutes. I said, "And tomorrow?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tomorrow we stop the wedding." The lawyer's name was Patricia, and she had a way of explaining complicated things in very short sentences, which I appreciated given the state I was in. She sat across from me in the hotel room with a yellow legal pad, and she laid it out. The forged deed transfer meant the house had never legally left my name. Diane had been living there under a fraudulent claim of ownership for 6 years. The mortgage she had refinanced twice was based on fraudulent title. The equity she had extracted was fraud. The rental income from the back unit she had converted and rented out for 4 years was collected under false pretenses. Patricia said, "We have a filing ready to go. Emergency injunction, title dispute, fraud claim. We file at 8 tomorrow morning when the courthouse opens. The wedding is at 11. I said, "What happens at 8:01? She said, "We notify her attorney, and we make sure he tells her." I didn't sleep much. I lay in the hotel room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the box in the garage. And what would have happened if I hadn't gone looking for old paperwork? If I hadn't found the will? If I hadn't walked into the kitchen and asked Diane about the house on the one evening when everything was already in motion? I thought about my mother, about the 11 years she spent paying off a mortgage on a nurse's salary, about the fireproof box in the hall closet, about the signature that wasn't hers on a document she never would have signed. At 7:45, my father knocked on my door and we drove to the courthouse together. Patricia filed at 8:02. Her associate called Diane's attorney at 8:17. I know the exact times because I was watching the clock on my phone and the numbers felt important, like markers on a road I'd been driving down for years without knowing where it was going. At 9:30, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered it. Diane said, "You have no idea what you're doing." She was using her calm, precise tone, but there was something underneath it that I had never heard before. Something that sounded like concrete beginning to crack. I said, "I found Mom's will." She said, "That will is 20 years old." I said, "Yes, and the deed transfer is a forgery." Patricia's team has the forensic report. You have a good morning. I hung up. At 11 o'clock, the time the wedding was supposed to start, I was sitting in Patricia's office going through documents. My father was there. He'd ordered sandwiches from the place down the block, and I ate half of one without tasting it. At 11:22, Patricia's phone rang. She listened for 90 seconds, said thank you, and hung up. She said, "The wedding has been postponed indefinitely." She paused. Her fiancé's attorney made a statement. He cited the outstanding legal claims against his client as requiring time to resolve before proceeding. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then my father said, "I'm sorry. For all of it. For the 6 years. For the calculation I made." I looked at him across the table. He had aged. There was the scar and the gray hair and something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. A weight he'd been carrying for a long time in rooms by himself. I said, "I'm not ready to be done being angry at you." He said, "I know." I said, "But I'm glad you came back." The legal process took 4 months. Diane fought it. Of course she did. She had 6 years of her life embedded in that property and a story she had told herself about how she deserved it and what my mother would have wanted and what my father had done to the family. People who commit fraud of this scale always have a story they have told themselves so many times, it feels like memory. It wasn't. It was a story. The forensic documents examiner testified. Patricia's team produced the original deed records, the refinancing paperwork, the rental income filings. Diane's attorney tried to argue that my father's fraudulent death created a chain of circumstances that entitled her to the property under some theory of equitable interest that Patricia demolished in about 4 sentences. The judge ruled in my favor on all counts. The house came back into my name. The mortgage Diane had taken out was her liability. The equity she had extracted, just over $240,000 over 6 years, was subject to a civil judgment. The rental income was added to the damages calculation. The day the judgment came through, I drove to the house alone. I had a key. Patricia had arranged for the locks to be changed the week before, once the injunction was confirmed. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a minute looking at the front porch. The porch light was still the same one that had buzzed above me that night in November. I made a note to replace it. I went inside. The house smelled different than I remembered. Diane had repainted several rooms and replaced the carpet in the hallway and moved things around in ways that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with erasure. There were no photographs of my mother anywhere. I had expected that, but it still hit me in the chest when I walked through. I went to the hall closet. The fireproof box was gone. Diane had taken it or disposed of it, but the closet itself was still there. The same dimensions, the same light switch on the left side, the same faint smell of cedar from a block my mother had put on the shelf when I was 7 years old and apparently never removed. The cedar block was still there. I picked it up and held it. I had a conversation with my father about once a week now. We weren't back to whatever we had been before. I wasn't sure that things still existed or that I wanted to rebuild exactly that thing. We were building something new, which was slower and less comfortable and probably more honest. He had gone back to work, a smaller operation now, a consulting role with a firm in the city, and he seemed to carry himself a little lighter than he had in those first weeks. Not light exactly, lighter. Diane, I heard through Patricia, had moved to stay with her sister in another state. The civil judgment hung over her. That was not my concern. My concern was the house. My concern was the cedar block on the shelf and the rooms that needed repainting and the photographs I was going to bring back. I was standing in the hallway when my phone buzzed. A message from Patricia. She said the final transfer documents were recorded with the county that morning and everything was official. I stood in my mother's house, in my house, in the house that had never legally stopped being mine, and I read the message twice. Then I walked to the kitchen, found a glass in the cabinet that Diane had at least not replaced, filled it with water from the tap, and stood at the window looking out at the backyard. The yard needed work. The garden my mother had kept along the back fence had gone wild and overgrown, and the fence itself leaned slightly to the left. It was going to take a weekend, maybe 2. I was already thinking about where to start. That's the thing about getting back what's yours. It doesn't arrive clean. It arrives as it is, carrying everything that happened to it while it was away from you. You don't get the version you lost. You get the current version, the one that needs work, the one that shows the years. That's fine. I had time. I was home. If you've been through something like this, if someone has taken something that belonged to you and told themselves a story about why they deserved it, I want you to know that the paperwork exists. The records exist. The truth tends to leave evidence even when the people hiding it believe they've been careful. Start with what you know. Find the documents. Ask the questions even on the nights when the asking gets the door locked behind you. The door was locked behind me for 4 months in ways large and small, and I'm standing in the kitchen now. Thank you for being here with me.